in the world today, which is this high-tech, creative class. You got to have lots of education. You have to have highly technical skills. They provide the education for free, right? Because it's equality for all citizens have to have a chance. When I say free, I'll give you an example because we lived there for a while. We say high school should be free here, and we've all accepted that. We don't call that socialism or anything. That's right. That's just. But then we stop with that. Well, they don't stop there, right? College is free. They don't stop there either. Law school is free. Medical school is free. Business school is free. And so most people there have at a minimum a master's because it's free. And the city actually helps. They give you subsidized housing when you are studying. They actually give you a stipend when you are studying. So people are truly free to keep learning. And they know, as a city, what the balance of kind of jobs they have and what they need their citizens, what training they need to have. So they make it possible. Here, we just kind of, it's a crapshoot. Good luck, and we blame people if they don't get the education. That's to me the issue. For Chicago to become equitable and inclusive.
To Copenhagen.
No, but we have to change our assumptions about what we're about. What is the city for? As long as we keep saying it is about the market and creating jobs and such, we will have what we have. That's what market cities, that's the outcome of that, starting that frame of thinking.
Anybody else on jobs?
You know, I think you're going to bring up the cost of segregation study later.
Go ahead.
But I just will say that segregation and uneven development costs. And so I think when we talk about market cities, what I imagine is, versus people cities, I just imagine people cities as measuring economic health in the mid to long term, whereas market cities are measuring economic health in the short term.
Quarterly.
And so it's the job of government. I mean, if the job of government is to get out of the way, then there never would have been a government. It's the job of government to massage these systems for the good of the community. So I think what we're seeing in Chicago is not economic mindedness versus. I know your model says all this, but what we're seeing in Chicago is not economic mindedness versus people mindedness, or greed versus compassion. It's really economic horizon. And so there's a lot of different ways when you look at it that way, because, we have to ask, what can we actually do in the United States? We don't have free college education. We don't have this, we don't have that. And if we're the first city to do all that without any structural support from the state or the nation, we probably won't be extremely successful. We'll probably lose a lot of money. So a lot of this stuff needs to be done at higher levels. But in terms of the things we can do, we are definitely losing money by having the majority of our neighborhoods disinvested, rather than, while we get headlines for the investment in gentrifying neighborhoods, that's not the case in most of our neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods are lost productivity in countless human ways.
Let's stay on that topic. You used the G word there.
Sorry.
Gentrification. That's probably one of the biggest villainous word. And you've called yourself in your book a gentrifier. I think of gentrifier as some Marvel Comics villain, swooping down on neighborhoods, planting Starbucks and organic pet food shops. But gentrification is
I think it's butcher shops now, actually.
Butcher?
Yeah, I really do. I think it's butcher shops.
Okay, all right. But there's probably no more a weighted topic or punching bag for what's going on in Chicago and communities all across the country than gentrification. Similar to our first question, defining and unpacking equity and inclusive growth. Let's create a framework and a definition for what gentrification really is, then we can beat it up.
So if you're interested in this issue, in terms of defining gentrification, on Twitter I created a hashtag definitions of gentrification. There are currently at least 20 the one that that I, and in our book that we go with is the reinvestment. This definition has a lot of important components. The reinvestment of real estate capital or real estate investment money, the reinvestment of real estate capital into disinvested and devalued neighborhoods. So that's the first half. To create a new residential infrastructure for middle and high income inhabitants. So the first thing that's important, and I'll just say real quick, the reinvestment of real estate capital into disinvested and devalued neighborhoods to create a new residential and commercial infrastructure. It should really be and or commercial infrastructure for middle and high income inhabitants. The first really important thing in this, which is why most suburbs cannot gentrify, is that this is reinvestment. There was a D at some point. And so one of the things that we talk about in the book is the 11 Ds and the 11 Res. So in order for investment to come back, you have to ask the question, why did it leave? And there's various contexts of injustice as to why it left. If investment left because of a tsunami, unless there was some other underlying factor that caused some people to be hurt more than others by the tsunami, then that's not particularly unjust. But if investment left because of the withholding of mortgage capital from that neighborhood for 50 years, and it causes homes to be 1/5 the value of the same house 2 miles north, then that is particularly unjust. So that's where a lot of the injustice of gentrification comes in, is what caused the D. Other aspects of injustice come in regards to the re. How is the investment coming back? And to what degree does the government that caused the D have amnesia and say, oh, well, justice is just allowing this flood of investment to come in? Well, you didn't just enter this situation. This situation's been baking for decades and decades and 70 years. So it's a very different context, and that type of reinvestment needs to be managed differently. From an inclusion perspective, structurally, if you were explicitly exclusionary in time A, the best hope of reversing that is to be explicitly inclusionary in time B. And not just by letting the free market solve the problems, because the free market didn't create the problem. So I'll start with that.
Well, I'm going back to Michael's maps. Is it that creative class, that creative map that's pushing some of these poor people out of the city? Like, is that actually happening? Or is that a myth? Is gentrification really the core issue? Or is it something else? I think you were sort of alluding to it may actually be the segregation. It may actually be these policies that have kept these communities, these neighborhoods disinvested. But are we experiencing a wave of gentrification that we should be concerned about?
Chicago has hyperly gentrifying communities, and then has communities that aren't touched at all. And it follows two things. It follows, there's a lot of different issues, but it follows the degree of that gap to an extent. I mean, how much real estate, I like to say real estate doesn't go on sale. So if there is a tremendous gap between what a home is worth and what a home is worth somewhere else in the city, there's a story behind that gap. And so the communities that were hit by the Ds are particularly vulnerable to be hit by the Res. Now, if you add in urban planning plans from the 1970s and 80s and 90s to explicitly target those areas that were hit by Ds, such as policies such as mortgage redlining, but also racial covenants, just to put policy names to these things, The highway building plans, urban renewal plans from 1949 to 1949 to 1974. This is real estate that if the city can convince people that this is a good place to move, then it's very advantageously priced. But that takes the city doing some massaging, which is the complete opposite of equity, because it's inviting more of a problem rather than solving the problem that was already created. There is the other issue in terms of what neighborhoods are most likely to be gentrified. White ethnic neighborhoods are probably most likely to be gentrified, followed by Latinx communities, and followed after that by predominantly black communities. So white movers in particular, Robert Sampson at the University of Chicago did some great research about the threshold that white in-movers have in regards to moving into majority non-white communities. And they have different thresholds for majority, or for dominant black communities, dominant Latinx communities, dominant white communities. So all of these insidious variables can be played for economic growth, or they can be played, which is simply short-term economic growth, or they can be played for mid to long-term economic growth and social health. And we are a market city to the extent that we have allowed the former. I'd be curious to hear at some point maybe your thoughts on New York, which I think has done over the 20th century a much better job than Chicago of managing structural inclusion, not perfect by any means, and is certainly a market city, but in the midst of that market has managed structural inclusion. And so one thing I like about your relative measures is we're not measuring Chicago against an ideal, but against other cities.
Just two comments. It's interesting when you talk about the short-term economic focus versus long-term. Every plan that is done in Copenhagen has to be in a 30-year time frame. So it doesn't matter if you lose money for the first 28 years, if after 30 years it makes money. So you're very right. It's a completely different time frame and way of judging themselves. New York is interesting. It ought to be even more market city. It has much more economic dynamism and everything, but it is not compared to Chicago in our measures. It's less of a market city, and it's still a market city, of course. Very interesting, in the last 5 to 10 years, they have hired experts from Copenhagen to come Copenhagenize New York. So that they have people there constantly. In fact, some of the folks that worked on transitioning, because Copenhagen was itself a market city back in 50s, 60s, 70s, even to the 80s. They have paid them enough to permanently relocate them to New York to just work full-time on it. It's very fascinating. So there's something, different going on there than here.
No, and that's really interesting. I think about gentrification. Some communities are extremely fearful. Communities that are full of disinvestment, but the first sign of, the slightest new piece of infrastructure or new bike lanes, new shops, they're petrified that their community's going to gentrify, they're going to be priced out. Then on the flip side of that, like you said, that there's this threshold, and Natalie Moore talks about it eloquently in her book, The South Side, particularly around Bronzeville. You've got a community with beautiful brown and gray stone buildings, large boulevards, but they had a hard time getting a grocery store before Mariano's came in. So you certainly do see those patterns of communities slowly opening up. So some people want gentrification; they want their community. It's actually it means there is investment, there is reinvestment in those areas, but they don't want to be priced out. Is there growth without displacement? Is that possible? Is that possible?
Well, what's interesting is that in the conversation, I'm just struck by the fact that we haven't really talked about the investment in the people, and the fact that Chicago and Chicagoland as a region, most of us can't afford the housing costs, right? I think we're almost to the point where you have to make close to 6 figures in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment these days in our communities. This is across the city, across the county. So I wonder if we are not thinking, we're thinking about gentrification and displacement, but as in certain communities, but I also think we need to think about how we are developing people to be able to meet the challenges that investment or development and growth mean. So we're trying to grow and expand and invest and develop the spaces and places, but the people are lagging. If we only have certain people participating in the creative class or in the maker economy, and there are other people who are participating in the service class or in the service economy, then how are they ever going to balance? And if there's, there's only, right now, there's only so many spaces for people to be able to either own businesses or to step into that economy, so that we know that there are fewer and fewer people who own or who manage or maintain the majority of the wealth. So if we're not finding ways for folks to generate and keep and earn wealth in our communities, then I think we all are going to be displaced. I think we just haven't figured out a great way. And so I like the idea of what you were talking about, Copenhagen's long-term plans, because I think that helps, or could be a way to help folks think about what are the things that need to happen for the people to support the plans that our friends in development have laid out for our investments in community and placemaking. So I don't know, I think I do think gentrification and displacement of people of color and communities of color is a real thing, but I think we also need to be thinking about, is our market outpacing the people in our city, in our community?
Great. Let's look at parts of the discussion that we don't usually talk about, particularly when we talk about investing in people. We've used European examples quite a bit, but in Europe, universal basic income is being experimented with. Certainly, there was experiment in Finland. Want to know your perspective on approaches like that, and then also in the national debate in the United States. Particularly with the 2020 election and a House Bill 40, there's been more and more discussion and frequency, and I think just sort of freedom to talk more about reparations for African Americans, putting money into the hands of people that have suffered from, as you said, Jim Crow all the way back to slavery. You're seeing that in many communities, people have not had the ability to ever generate wealth in this country. Should that be a part of the discussion when we talk about inclusive growth?
I want to keep talking. I want to give them a chance to ask questions too.
Yeah.
Just if you map the wealth gap between black and white, between Hispanic and white, and we've been able to do that since the 80s now, and we've been keeping very careful tabs on it. That wealth gap has more than doubled, maybe even tripled. It just keeps growing. It takes money to make money. The more money you have, the more wise investment chances you have. Even if you get the same return, you can make more money because you have more to start with, right? If we don't do something like that, the data is clear as a bell. This gap will only continue to increase. Eventually, we'll have another civil war. The place will explode, not just here, but across the whole country. We can't continue it. We just cannot. The gap that exists between our racial groups in the U.S., you would be hard-pressed to find such a gap in any third world country anywhere. It's astounding to me that we still can somehow coexist and haven't had massive eruption yet. I know we did in the 60s, but it's way worse now. Yeah, so we have to figure out a way.
I appreciate that. Last question before we take questions from the audience. There's a new mayoral administration, Mayor Lightfoot. She recently put out a tweet or Instagram post that her North Star was going to be inclusion and equity. What does that actually mean? How should she play that out? How can you set up a new administration? If you were part of the transition team, advising her, fresh start for the city. There's a lot of hope. What should she be thinking about structurally to put in place? And I'm going to start with Tiffany on this because I know this is your wheelhouse.
So I think a big piece of it is trying to find the low-hanging fruit, but finding ways to engage people in communities to create and work alongside the mayor, the administration, city departments, city officials to right those wrongs, but then also have just metrics and accountability. So we were chatting a little bit about this earlier. A lot of the time when these plans are written and they talk about, even now we're talking about racism, we're starting to see that more in city documents and reports. But there are very few, if any, metrics around what does that mean and what does equity look like, and then ways for communities and residents to engage in monitoring and evaluating the outcomes. So I think that would be the first strategy, is having systems of accountability for all of the city departments, all of the city programs, for communities and residents to be a part of. I mean, that's a very simple way. I mean, simple in my mind, but I think it's a quick way to say, okay, here's a way that we are opening doors, we're opening process, we're like demystifying it, and we're allowing people to have data and access to the information about what's really going on. Without the data on like ability to track, I think we're never going to achieve it, and it just becomes something that gets thrown away in the reports or in the plan. So then by the next year, it gets forgotten. So it just allows us to hold each other accountable.
If you can't measure it, it's not real.
Right.
Yeah, I would say exactly that. Every decision has to run through that rubric then. Does this get us closer to that goal or further away? I'll use the example, you see the picture there of the train. We have one line that goes through the whole city. And I would say to the mayor, it's the red line, right? On the north side, there is a stop every half mile, and the line goes to the very end of the city. In fact, you can then get on another line that goes into the suburbs. On the south side, that very same line, there isn't a stop every half mile, there's a stop every mile. And of course it stops, and there are at least 40 blocks that have no train service at all. So if you're using that rubric of equity and inclusion, and you're working for the transportation, give me the plan for how you're going to equalize that red line on the north side and the south side. How much is it going to cost? How are we going to get the money? I'll give you an example of what we do here. So we are now a majority minority in our student body. But in our faculty, we are currently 18% faculty of color. So we put a plan into place that we call 25 by 25. It will be 25% of our faculty will be faculty of color by 2025, 6 years. So using how many typically per year faculty we hire, we calculate that a third of our hires between now and then have to be faculty of color to reach our goal. So that's our rubric. Every year we judge ourselves on it. We don't meet it. What do we have to change? If we meet it, let's keep doing that.
Congratulations on doing that.
Well, yeah, we'll see if we make it, but that's the goal. Yeah.
I would just add, there was a lot said during the election about spreading the investment. And that potentially could be amazing or extremely dangerous, right? I mean, again, there is affordable housing in Chicago. There are houses that cost $40,000 and $50,000, you know, and if you have 4 blocks of that, you know, for a few $1 million, you can knock them all down. And that's spreading investment. So these people, the system, the people at the table need to be community organizations down. I mean, sometimes when we're trying to include communities in visioning, we start above the community organizations. But this really needs to be some grassroots stuff to determine if we're going to spread the investment, where is it going to be, and putting systems in place that this neighborhood can handle this investment without being immediately displacing. And then we have to have horizons. Well, if there's property values are going to rise. I mean, property values are going to rise. Remember, you know, the West Loop, the near West Side, the South Loop, this was all spreading investment too, So that was a plan in the 70s, right? And we call it the loop now. Anything that has investment, we now call the loop. So we know we've arrived when we call the whole city the loop, right? But then I think another piece is thinking about the metropolitan region, that we very much have an osmosis going on between the city and the suburbs. And there's a lot of flux occurring in suburbs as well, and a lot of hugely different outcomes in various suburbs, northwest and south. And so this is a conversation that Chicago needs to begin to take the lead in, because the world is thinking in terms of regions. And many other, even American, US cities are way ahead of us in thinking of regions. And we're still not there.
Thanks, Sean. Let's talk to some people in our region. There must be some questions out there.
Or solutions.
Or solutions. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Talk about the Copenhagen model. They're taxing. Is that true?
They're
The Copenhagen model, are the people taxed more to achieve the successes that places like Copenhagen have?
Absolutely, they are. They are taxed more. And what do they get for the tax? They get the free education, the free health care. They get. This is a strange example, but it illustrates how far it goes. My family moved there. We had, at that time, 2 children under the age of 18. We were just there for 1 year on a work visa, not citizens. Got a letter from the city that said, in honor and support of raising your family, we will be depositing money monthly into your bank account. And they get hundreds of dollars a month because we have children, and they're trying to help us raise our children. We moved back to the US after a year. Our children were still under 18 for another 3 years. They kept putting money into our account. We kept writing and said, we don't live there anymore. They said, we still want to help you raise your children. So we interviewed a lot of people there about the high taxes they pay, and they say it's worth it. That's what they said uniformly. Yeah.
We're all moving to Copenhagen after this. Maybe that's where everyone's going. That's where Chicago is moving. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of deliberation and citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, and that kind of thing. And I've been trying up in Northwest to get people to do deliberations. When I first moved to Chicago, I wanted to get a really big one across the whole of Chicago, a G1000, just very optimistic, enthusiastic. But I ran into problems that people didn't know what it was, they hadn't heard of it. And I think the main thing is prioritizing, having a target topic which would be really powerful, that would engage everyone in the city. So if we were going to have a deliberation across the whole of Chicago, what would be like priority topics? And how do we go about engaging the mayor in doing that? Those are my questions.
Topics for mass deliberations, conversations.
If you want to get inclusion, you've got to give them power to make recommendations to the mayor. That's what we need. Yeah. So what are those topics? You probably said most of them.
I'll just say real quick. I'll say real quick, and then someone can follow up. That I think the purpose is that you don't start with what the ideas are, right? I mean, you start without any ideas, and you begin.
You do it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kellen, being an extremely organized host, gave us hundreds of pages of reading, which I actually read them all, partly thanks to a 6-hour delay in a flight I had this week. But models in Utah, in the state of Utah, and in Barcelona, and kind of the very grassroots percolation of ideas and precipitation, slow growth of ideas from the street level, and then the trust that occurs in policy as the result of that. I mean, right now, Mayor Lightfoot's putting together the transition team, and it's a lot of organization heads, and the organization heads are coming with their conclusions of what they've already figured out. I think we need to break that down. And actually, that great example from the Utah case was the vote against public transportation to a vote for public transportation in a span of 10 years, just because these researchers believed, because of the changing orientation with which they approach